Well, we know that the Pentagon has said in a congressional committee that it expects some sort of move by Beijing against Taiwan militarily within about 6 years, which they seem to be working backwards. 6 years' time is when they expect that Beijing will have military parity or superiority over the US forces in and around the Taiwan Straits. In other words, as soon as they think Beijing is capable of matching or outmatching the US forces, it will make a forcible move to take Taiwan. However, it's also true that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs in the US, General Mark Milley, said recently that while the Pentagon didn't expect anything in the next 18 months to 2 years, he said anything can happen. And I think anybody who looked at the recent record of US predictions and strategic analysis in the case of Afghanistan would have to have diminished confidence in the Pentagon's ability to predict anything, given that the US actually had occupation of Afghanistan, but still failed to predict the speed with which the government in Afghanistan would collapse under the force of an incoming Taliban movement.
Now, part of this so-called two-pronged war involves ramping up aggressions towards India. How aggressive can Beijing get, given the recent border skirmishes in the Himalayas?
Well, the Pentagon annual report on China's defense activities that came out, as you said, in recent days, said that the Beijing government was preparing for a two-front contingency where it would have what they called a Taiwan exigency going on, as well as a heightened border confrontation with India on the opposite end of China's geography. So the assumption there would have to be that Beijing has launched some sort of military aggression against Taiwan, but is aware that India might take advantage of that to try to advance its interests and its territory against China on the Himalayan front, and so is preparing for a two-front operation. To answer your question, Girish, how aggressive could China get? Well, it could get quite aggressive, certainly from the extent of the military preparations underway. It could get extremely aggressive. It has the capability. The question is whether it has the intent. It's certainly not making any indication that it's only got a short-term interest in the border confrontation with India. For example, this very same Pentagon report on Chinese activities says that during last year's deadly skirmish across the India-China border, which saw the first deaths between those two militaries in 46 years, that at that time, the Chinese forces were busy laying fiber optic cables along the Himalayan border, some of the most remote and inhospitable territory on the planet. So, they are settling in for a pretty serious, long-term confrontation and warfare along that border.
Now, the Pentagon also says China wants to set up various military bases in countries that even we have close relations with, Singapore and Indonesia, but also further afield in Pakistan and Sri Lanka. What are the sort of conversations do you think are being had within Canberra and Washington on that matter?
Well, I know that between the governments that you've just mentioned, US, Australia, like-minded countries, India, that there's a great deal of consternation about the expansion of China's, not just its military footprint, but its dual-use so-called bases. China boasted for a very long time that it had never maintained an overseas base. Well, that changed a few years ago when they set up a dual-use base in Djibouti, in the African country of Djibouti, where it was initially purely a civilian container facility, but now it's also being used by the Chinese Navy. Similarly, the Chinese Navy is setting up dual-use facilities in Sri Lanka, you mentioned. India is responding, by the way. India has just done a deal to set up a major commercial operation to take control of a port in Sri Lanka, which India had never done before. So right around the world, and of course Australia has been alarmed in the last year or two about reports of China doing some scouting activities to see if they could set up a military base in the South Pacific. So right around the world, there is now a rising level of concern about China's ambition in setting up what initially appear to be Chinese civilian-based ports and bases around the world, but are also equipped for dual use, meaning the Chinese Navy and military can also use those ports and facilities. So to answer your question in summary, Girish, the Western world, broadly defined, including countries like Japan and India, are now alert and alarmed.
And Peter, what is also startling many observers who've read the Pentagon's report are claims that Beijing could increase its nuclear weapons arsenal from around 200 warheads to 700 before the end of this decade. How seriously are governments around the world taking this?
Well, it's consistent with China's overall expansion of all its capabilities, everything from space, militarization of space, to the Antarctic. It has a very well-developed, fast-moving Antarctic policy as well. So the Chinese government and the military is moving rapidly to expand on all fronts. So stepping up its nuclear capability is consistent with that. China has increased its total military spending by about roughly 75% in the last 10 years, which is double the rate of Australia's military spending increase, for example. And so with that, you can buy a lot more capability. So the Pentagon report talks about China increasing what really has been just a bare minimum deterrent force of a couple of hundred Chinese nuclear-armed, nuclear-capable missiles. I mean, remember, the Americans have got something like 7,000. So it's been a minimum deterrent. But now, consistent with its general military expansionism, China is seen by the Pentagon to be stepping it up to, as you say, 700 and beyond that to 1,000. And recently, satellites detected that the Chinese government was building 3 new fields in different parts of the Chinese continent of missile silos from which it could launch nuclear-capable intercontinental ballistic missiles. So all of that is proceeding apace.
Peter Hartcher, always good to get your thoughts. Thanks very much.
Pleasure, Girish.